Welcome to Audiobook 365 Stories.
Jacqueline searched in the box for another cigarette and held it unlit in her hand as she continued talking. I don't remember much of what happened in the next few hours after that. Somehow, I found my way back to Paris because when it was still dark, I was standing at the edge of a riverbank looking into the Seine River. It was raining and my clothes were very wet. I didn't know what I was doing or how I got there. A light from the other side of the river made a reflection in the water, almost to my feet. As I looked down, I saw my baby in the water. Her voice became very quiet, and she leaned toward Marie, her eyes looking wild. I guess you think I'm crazy, right? Couldn't have seen? Well, you don't know everything about babies, my girl. Have you ever seen your baby in the river? She asked fiercely. The girl only replied with a dry sob and a shiver. Well, you will if you run away with that stupid soap seller of yours, she grumbled, settling back in her chair. I was just going to get into the river and take my baby in my arms when someone caught my wrist and I heard a man's voice asking, "Are you ill, madam?" I don't know what I said, but he put his arm around mine, led me into a small cafe, and made me drink some brandy before he let me say a word. Then he called a taxi and asked me where I lived. In the light of the cafe, I had a chance to look at him when the brandy made me feel a little warmer. I knew from his accent that he was an Englishman. He had curly brown hair and pink and white skin. He was a nice-looking young man. He seemed to be less than 30, and he talked and acted toward me as he would if I had been his sister. When the taxi came, he wanted to take me home in it. I told him that I had no place to go and begged him to go away and leave me. He sat down again, and I don't remember how much of my story I told him. He told me afterward that I fainted in the taxi. When I understood things clearly again, I was lying in a big soft bed in a beautifully decorated room. There were pictures and statues and heavy curtains everywhere. Weapons and books were scattered about. There was a small table covered with bottles next to my bed and a nurse sitting nearby. When she saw that I was awake, she told me that I was in the Englishman's apartment and that I had been very sick for 3 weeks. In a little while, he came in and told me how he had brought me home and called a doctor and nurse. The doctor said that I almost had a serious brain illness. I went to sleep again soon and did not wake until the next day. The nurse stayed for less than a week after that, and he came into my room and read and talked to me for hours. He told me all about himself. He was the son of a rich English family and loved painting, which he had plenty of money to do. He was a bright, happy young man, and with his care, I got better quickly. He never asked me about my past or my plans for the future. When I was able to sit up comfortably in bed, he brought his painting tools into the room and painted me. He was given a special mention for it. All this time I was worrying about what I would do when I was strong enough to leave his rooms. I decided that I would try to find work in hat shops. One day I told him that I would be leaving soon, and he looked very serious and asked me what I planned to do. I told him, and he agreed with the plan. During all this time, he had not looked at me with any passion. He insisted that when I was able to go out, I should live there until I could make a living, and he loaned me the money to buy clothes that I needed. I did not love him, but I admired him for his kindness. Finding work was hard and disappointing, and I could not make enough money to live on decently. I had never had to be very careful with money before, and I did not know how. He advised me, helped me, cheered me up as much as he could, and we ate dinner together every night. I was making a few francs a week trimming hats, and when we began talking about our day, those little dinners were almost fun. I was learning to hate my husband with a hate that would be with me until I die, and the glow in her dark eyes showed the truth of her words, and when John, my Englishman, told his jokes and stories, the pain of missing my boy did not hurt so much. Then I lost my terrible job, and it was days before I got another, although it was a better one when I did find it. During that time, he was even more kind and attentive and did not let me feel hopeless for long. One night after I went back to work, we were sitting in the room where I had been sick, and he was telling me, with many laughs, about a picture that a fellow student was painting. As I watched his clean, handsome face and listened to his happy talk, I thought of all that he had done for me, that he had asked for nothing and received nothing but my empty words of thanks, and my eyes filled with tears. The next moment, I was kneeling before his chair, kissing his hands. His story stopped with a gasp, and I felt him shake. Then he pulled his hands away and lifted me up to him, and I kissed his lips and eyes and hair again and again. And that night, I gave him all I had to give. He never really loved me, but he was happy with me for a long time. When he went back to England, he took me with him. His home was only a few hours from London, where he found a place for me to stay. He was with me more than he was at his home. Finally, his visits were not so often and regular, and they kept happening less and less until one time I didn't see him for nearly 3 weeks. When he came, he told me he had to say something that would hurt me, but he couldn't help it. He had fallen in love with an English girl whom he had known all his life and wanted to marry her. So he would have to leave me. He was always very generous with money, and he wanted to keep giving me the same amount he had given me when I settled in London. But I was too proud to take it. I took the money I had saved, packed my clothes, and left that day. I found a cheap room and started looking for work again. I got a job as a clerk in a hat store. By living very carefully, I did not have to use my savings often. But I had to use them a little, and I was starting to feel worried when an American theater man, who was spending part of the summer in England, came into the store to buy some ladies' gloves. I helped him, and in a few days, I left my cheap room and went back to New York with him that fall. He wasn't as kind as the Englishman was. "You'll find that out, too, my girl," she said with a bitter smile. "After the first few, your lovers don't care much about your feelings." He left me with nothing less than a month after we got to New York. I tried to get work, but I couldn't. The woman where I stayed took all my clothes, except what I was wearing, to pay for my room, and then she threw me out. I walked the streets all that night, and the next day without any food, and the next night I stopped a well-dressed man and asked him if he could give me some money for food. He walked on as if he didn't hear me, and then the next moment, a man stepped out of a doorway and told me I was under arrest. He took me to a police station where I spent the rest of the night in a cell, and the next morning I was taken to court. The detective who arrested me told the judge that he had seen me speak to a strange man on the street, and the judge gave me a choice of paying a fine of 25 francs or going to prison for a month. I tried to explain that I hadn't had anything to eat for 2 days and that I only asked the man for a little money, but they wouldn't listen to me. Just as they were about to take me to prison, as I had seen them take 3 or 4 other girls before me, a young man, very stylishly dressed, came forward and said he would pay my fine. The clerk took his money and he led me out of the courtroom. When we were outside, I tried to thank him, but I was so weak with hunger and tiredness that I could hardly speak or stand. He took me to a small restaurant nearby and made me eat until I felt I would never be hungry again. During breakfast, he learned that I was alone, without friends, and had no money. He said he would help me. I went with him, and he took me to his room where we stayed all day. That night he took me out, saying he'd find me a room of my own. We went to a nice house not far from one of the main streets, where a kind woman greeted us at the door. He asked me to sit down while he explained to her about me, and when she came to show me my room, she was very nice. But the next morning, my clothes were gone, and there was only a low-cut robe in their place, which I couldn't wear outside. I was trapped. I stayed in that house for over a year. Sometimes I made 75, 100, or even 150 francs in a day and night, but I wasn't allowed to keep any of the money. The woman took some, and the man who brought me there took the rest. I thought about running away 2 or 3 times, but the other girls in the house warned me that I'd get caught and sent to prison and would end up back with him anyway. Some of them had tried to escape when they were first brought there. Jacqueline stopped speaking, her voice losing its emotion. She took another gulp from the ether bottle and lit the cigarette she had been holding. She stayed silent for so long that Marie looked up at her, trembling with a mix of fear and sadness. "Is that everything?" she whispered softly. Jacqueline burst into a harsh, bitter laugh. "Everything? Huh, that's just the beginning. Do you know where I've been for the last 15 years? I've been where you'll end up if you leave with your soap peddler." She glared fiercely. I was sent all over, always living the same life, always with a different boss. Finally, I made it back to New York and had to work on the streets to make money for the man who owned me. One rainy night, when I was cold and wet, a girl showed me that taking an opium pill could make me feel better. After that, I always had some kind of drug. But I found out that ether was the best. Ether is the best. She looked lovingly at the little bottle. I don't know how many years I was in the land of the free. I would have been better off there than anywhere else if it hadn't been for a bunch of foolish women who tried to save me. There are plenty of rich women there with nothing to do, and instead of doing nothing, they stuck their noses into other people's business. I'd like to strangle some of them, she spat out viciously. "Save me," she sneered with a bitter laugh. They got hold of me once when I was arrested and gave me a job where I could make 25 or 30 francs a week if I worked hard. But they looked at me as if I were some kind of wild animal. When they put me in that workshop, they all said, "Now, you're fine." Fine. I could hardly stop myself from laughing in their faces. They couldn't put my boy in my arms or clean the stain from my body or heal the pain in my soul. but they thought that 25 francs a week would make everything okay. It barely paid for my food, whiskey, and drugs. And because I left, they called me incorrigible and sent me to prison. When they let me out of prison, the man who was collecting my money said I wasn't useful to him anymore in New York, so he sold me to someone taking women to South America. It's easy to find lovers there, and I wasn't there long before I was free again. Then I traveled from one city to another, sometimes with one man, sometimes with another, until I met him. She gestured toward the door, in Buenos Aires. A woman in a dance hall in Caracas taught me how to read fortunes with cards, and when I learned that I didn't have much time left and that I would see my son before I died, I wanted to go back to France. He brought me. There was a long pause, interrupted only by Marie's quiet crying. Jacqueline looked at her thoughtfully. Now, you're heading down the same path as me, she continued with a serious tone, fueled by the stimulants. Remember what I'm telling you, dear. When you run away with that man, you're saying goodbye to being a decent, happy woman. You'll only ever be a common one. Nobody will try to help you. Women will be harsher on you than men. Men will have their fun with you and push you down a bit, but women will push you down and curse at you while they do it. Well, I'm sure Anatole will never leave me, sobbed the girl. Jacqueline looked at her, as if debating whether it was worth continuing the argument. Then, fueled by the ether, she snapped with impatience. Fine, you foolish girl. Get out of here. Marie stood up, crying louder and more bitterly. Isn't there something I can do for you? No. Leave. As the girl closed the door behind her, Jacqueline's head fell onto the table with a long, painful sob. She remained silent for a while, then sat up and turned back to the cards once more.